Good to see you all. So that's us at 9 o'clock now, so we better kick off, so we're keeping in time for the day. Really pleased to see you all. Nice to meet you. Some of you might have seen me before on your studies through the magic of the internet, but it's nice to meet you in person. My name's Craig Collie. I'm one of the lecturers here in the department. I've been working here full-time for about a year now, but I was around before that because I was a teacher when I was doing my PhD as well. Great place, and it's lovely to have you here in person today. Nice to have our international audience as well, so hi everyone. Best behaviour, all you guys in the room, we're broadcast the world. So again, also my pleasure to be kicking off today's set of lectures and be following up yesterday's ones. And the topic that I've chosen to look at today is, why do we obey the law? Hiya, come on in. The reason I've chosen this one is it's something that's kind of around us all the time. The law is kind of ubiquitous, it's around us every day, and most of us, I dare say, tend to follow the law. But we don't always think about why exactly is it that we're doing that. So I'm going to investigate this topic a little bit today, and the aim is hopefully get you guys just thinking a little bit about this and reflecting a little bit on things you've maybe seen before, and give you some information on some ideas you've maybe not seen before, and introduce you to some legal theories about where the law comes from, why it's important, and all that. So let's crack on. An image that I quite like as a symbol for why we obey the law is this here, the humble red traffic light. Can anyone tell me what law or rule this is kind of demonstrating? Any ideas? Yeah, Road Traffic Act would be the particular piece of legislation. What rule within that is the red light showing? Doesn't have to be the correct section or anything. What do you do with your car at the red light? Yeah, stop it. That's the rule. We all stop our car at the red light. The reason I quite like that as a symbol of that is if you look at that on its own, pretend you're an alien, you've never heard of the law, you don't know about the Road Traffic Act. If you looked at that, you would never say, that's the thing that makes cars stop. But in day-to-day life, in effect, it is. We do tend to stop our cars at the red light. I'm not really aware of anyone who habitually just fires through the red light. There's probably someone, there always is, but normally we would stop there. And the interesting thing is, okay, why? There's no force field coming off the red light that's stopping our cars. Our car doesn't brake if we go through the red light. But there are other reasons why we stop there, and we do stop there. So I've got that as a bit of a reason why we might stop. You can probably think of a few reasons, aside from physically being stopped, that we might do that. We might be worried about Mr. Policeman behind us, who's going to give us a ticket. We might be doing it because everyone around us is stopping at the red light. Oh, they've all stopped, I better stop as well. We might be doing it because, as Derek mentioned, we're aware of what the law is. We're like, oh, well, I better follow the law, because that's what we do. We all follow the law. You may also think, well, because it's a law, it's therefore the right thing to do. And many other reasons why you might stop at the red light. So I just like that as an idea of getting to thinking about, okay, there's maybe reasons behind why we follow all these rules that seem simple, we do it without really thinking. So just get us in the mood for that. It's also a little bit symbolic for today, because all you guys are usually thinking about crime, serious crime. When we're talking about law, we're not always thinking about crime, especially the higher level stuff. Sometimes we're getting a bit lower to the ground, so road traffic rules is still a type of law, in addition to the stuff to do with murder and all that cool stuff. So today I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey through some legal theorists, and I've chosen these ones in particular because, to my mind, any given room, the reasons you've got for obeying the law as a kind of gut reaction would more or less be reflected somewhere in this group of scholars here. Don't worry about the names of them or anything like that. I'm just going to go through some of their ideas, float them to you, and see, and you can think to yourself, does that jive with my way of thinking and how I understand the world? So one of the first questions to ask when you're thinking about why is it that we obey the law is a bit of a grander question about where the law actually comes from. And a lot of the theories we'll be looking at, and theories that exist to do with the law, to do with obedience, to do with control, they start by asking, where does the law emanate from such that it has authority that makes us want to obey it or compels us to obey it. There's a few ways of looking at that, and one of the main ones is the idea that the law comes from on high, from above us. You could probably think of a few ways that might happen. And one way that's been suggested is it's coming from a celestial power of some kind, a religious power, potentially from God or gods. You might see a lot of the law today reflective of things that you've seen in the Bible and other religious texts. So historically, the law is maybe coming from a god. In a more modern approach to that, it's the same idea, but the law is a reflection of natural principles. The world is meant to be a certain way, and the law is meant to reflect that. So there's this idea that there's principles that pre-exist that the law is meant to reflect. So that's the idea of the law coming on high from something beyond people. Possibly more familiar to you and I is the idea of the law coming from people who are higher up than us in terms of their ability to make law. And the word that's often thrown around is the sovereign. But that can be a few things. They've got a crown there, so it could be a king or a queen. In Britain today, of course, it's the Parliament. They're the ones who we recognise as having the power to pass laws. And because they're above us, we've sort of given them permission, so to speak, to pass laws. We therefore obey the things that are coming from them. And it comes, so the law's coming from above us there as well. Interesting wrinkle. Historically, is this broken? No, there we go. Interestingly, those two things would have been related back in the day, especially in historic times. The reason the king or the sovereign was thought to have this power is because they'd been ordained by God. You might be familiar with the idea of the queen having blue bloods. That's where that idea kind of comes from, that they're blessed or higher than other people. So that link between the crown and religion has been used to justify their ability to make laws that everyone else has to follow. One of my favourite examples of that is from Norway. They had a king called King Magnus, and he had the awesome nickname of King Magnus the Law Mender. And he's one of the first people to come up with a criminal code. And he made everyone follow it. He compelled everyone to follow it, not by forcing them, but by convincing them that this reflected God's will, and that was what gave him permission. He wasn't just saying God said it. He's saying, not only did God give me permission, but this reflects his ideas as well. And if you look at that kind of old codex that he came up with now, it's got in it some things that look like human rights, some things that are universal values that we still have today. So that's quite interesting, because some older laws are, you'd see them now. Of course, today, the link between the state and any kind of God is questioned. We don't really think of it that way. It's much more secular. But the big point here is the idea is that the law is coming from above us, and that's why we follow it. And that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it, if this moves forward, nope. Excuse me, technical issue. Another way of looking at where the law comes from isn't that it comes from above us, but rather that the law comes from below. Not below as in underground, but below as in from us, the people. We are the grassroots who potentially give the law its power, so to speak. And that's often reflected in the idea of consensus, and what you might have heard of is something called the social contract. Now, the social contract, a lot of different scholars have talked about it. Got people like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, David Hume. I quite like Thomas Hobbes' way of explaining it. His idea is basically, in a lawless state, people are completely free. You've got complete freedom to do whatever you want without law. But in that state, it would be complete chaos. The strong would dominate the weak, would be in a constant state of warfare. So we have agreed, informally, to follow a set of rules that limit our freedom. If you think about laws, they're kind of limiting the things we're able to do, but we get a net gain from it. We can live in relative peace at the cost of giving up some of the absolute freedom we would naturally have. And it's this idea of the social contract, us agreeing to follow these rules, that gives us the willingness to follow it, and it gives the law its authority. And it relates back to what we saw from the law from above, in that we have given permission to Parliament or whoever to pass those laws on our behalf. So law here is seen as a bit more of an organising thing that we've all agreed to. Okay, so these are things to keep in mind, and we'll be revisiting some of these concepts as we go through, because they're quite important to some of the theories that we're looking at today. Okay, so what I'm going to do now, I'm basically going to take you through about 4 theories, perspectives on the law and why we follow it, and we're going to look at them and think, okay, does this reflect how we're thinking? The first one I've chosen to look at isn't actually a legal theory, it's a criminological theory. You may have seen this before. Has anyone seen social bond theory before? No? New one? Some people might have seen it. Doesn't matter if you've seen it or not, you'll be encountering it at some point. This is a theory about why, not exactly why people obey the law as such, but you could use it in that way. It's more about why people commit crime. And it relates to that idea of the social contract we just looked at, because it's what's called a control theory of crime. Now, a control theory of crime is based on the idea that everyone would commit crime if they could. Okay, so it's a bit of a Machiavellian kind of idea. But this guy, Travis Hershey, he said we all would commit crime except for social bonds, and that's why it's called social bond theory. So we all would do it except for the presence of these things called social bonds. And let's have a look at what he said. So social bonds, he said, took these forms. The most obvious one, and the one that might resonate with you guys the most, is this idea that we don't commit crime, or another way of putting it, we follow the law because we are attached to the people around us. Not just the people, but the organizations and things like that, our work. So we don't want to lose the relationships we've got with people as a result of committing crime and being looked at differently, or possibly physically removed as a result of having to go to jail. So your mum might be disappointed in you if you commit a crime or don't follow the law. You could lose your place at university if you don't follow the law, that kind of thing. Relating to that is the idea of commitment. These relationships you've got, you've spent a lot of time investing in them, building them up over a long time. And that commitment is a form of kind of capital. You would lose that time spent if you then sacrifice that relationship to carry out a crime or transgress the law. Another form of social bond is involvement. You've got all these things that you're doing, all these relationships, you've got your job. You're too involved doing that, you're too busy to be going around committing crimes. So that's another way of looking at that one. And finally, as a sum total of all of that, you've got belief. Because of the people around you, you believe that it's a good thing to follow the law. You don't want to disappoint the people around you. And because you've been raised in that environment, you don't commit crime and you follow the law. Now, as I said, that's normally a criminological theory. But you can also use it in a kind of more legalistic way, thinking about the law kind of way. And you can probably see how that maybe reflects the individual experience a bit more than some of those high-minded things I was talking about before, about where the law comes from. When you're obeying the law or not committing crime, you're not necessarily thinking about, this law comes from this cosmic principle, or this law was passed properly in the House of Parliament. You're maybe thinking more about, my mum would be so disappointed, the people around me behave in this way, therefore I behave in this way. It's a social way of looking at obedience that, to my mind, is probably more reflective of how people experience the world, and is something that is often missed in legal discourse because they go to this higher kind of level, this more procedural level that people can't really relate to. So for that reason, this theory is actually quite a useful way of thinking about why we obey or why sometimes people don't obey. You can maybe think of some problems and contradictions with this theory as well, though. You'll be aware of people who don't obey the law very often, and part of that might be because, well, as Hershey says, they don't have these social bonds. The people around them might be in the habit of committing crime, or they don't accept the authority of, say, the police. You might be aware of subcultures that think the police are bad, you shouldn't tell on people and all that. So those people aren't in the habit of obeying the written law, but that almost comes full circle. By not obeying the law as written, are they obeying this other kind of informal law? They're obeying the people around them still. They're following a code of sorts. It's maybe not written law. So by not obeying the mainstream, are they still obeying another thing? And that's something really interesting to think about, is does the law have to come from on high like that, or can it be, is this another form of social contract? So you can take these theories, these criminological theories you come across, and reuse them, redeploy them in a way that causes us to think about the law and how people behave. So quite an interesting theory there that you'll probably come across. So keep that in mind, control theories of crime. So what we're going to look at now is some slightly more traditional legal theories. This is the idea of fear of punishment was one of the reasons I gave when you're going through your red light. You might be worried about, oh no, I'm going to get a speeding ticket, I'm going to get points on my license. And this idea of punishment, of sanction, is central to legal theories, and in particular one called command theory. So the idea of punishment, quite a few scholars look at it. Here's a couple of the more obvious ones. We've got John Austin there, who we'll get to in a minute. And we've got Jeremy Bentham, who you may recognise if you've done sociology stuff, or you looked at legal classicism. His idea in terms of punishment and obeying the law was that, well, people make a bit of a calculation when they're going to commit a crime. Think, how much will I gain from committing this crime versus how much displeasure or discomfort will I receive from being punished? If that scale is in favour of pain, there will be more pain from committing the crime than benefit, people won't do it. And he reckons that's at the core of obedience in society and why people do that. Austin had a bit of a similar idea. This will hopefully catch up in a minute. I've clicked the button, we'll see what happens. Austin is what's called a legal positivist. You may have heard the term positivism when you've been doing research methods type stuff. Positivism basically means the form something takes. So in research, it's can you count it, how big is it? In law, it's kind of the same, but it means how is the law formed? Is it made in the right way? So when you hear the term legal positivism, they're asking, is this law valid by having been made in the right way? And they'll propose some rules about how the law is meant to be based on their observations of the legal system. And this is Austin's positivist theory. So he made these rules here about why he thinks the law is valid, and by being valid, we therefore obey it. So he reckons that to be valid, the law must come from a sovereign. We saw that earlier, the idea of the crown, the parliament, some recognised body that's allowed to pass the law. In addition, so these are additional requirements, people must be in the habit of obeying that sovereign most of the time. Okay, so that's quite important. Thirdly, the law must be issued as a command to people. That's why it's called command theory. So you shall do this, you shan't do that, you shall stop at the red light, you shan't kill people, and so on. Finally, and kind of crucially, the law must be backed by a sanction. And that is the final piece that makes the law complete and makes it so that we obey it, according to Austin. Okay? So what's happening there, once you've got all those, we've got a finished law. And that's interesting because, according to Austin, then, the essence of obedience, the reason we obey, is because, essentially, we've been threatened into it. There's power differentials going on. There's coercion involved in our obedience. We aren't necessarily doing it because we think it's a good thing. We're doing it because we know that there's power behind the law reflected in that sanction. Okay? So quite an interesting idea. Again, you can maybe recognise some issues with it or ask some questions about this. So we had the traffic light. So I posited that most people would stop at the red light. We're all in agreement that most people would stop at a red light? Yeah, more or less. What about on the motorway? Have we got any drivers in the room? Okay, most of you. What's the situation like on the motorway? What's the speed limit meant to be? 70? How fast do people normally go? 80, 85. How many people have had like a ticket for going over the speed limit on the motorway? Hardly anyone? Okay. Let's go back to Austin's rules. Okay. We've got the sovereign. They passed the law. They passed the speed limit. Most people are not in the habit of obeying that rule. Is it still a rule? Is it still a valid law under this number 3 still works. It's still a command, but we just established most people aren't getting punished for it. There's no sanction backing this up. There's one in theory, but there isn't one in practice a lot of the time. You never know when you might get speed scanned on the motorway, but most of the time that's not being enforced. Does that then break down to the extent that this no longer becomes a valid law? You can probably think of a lot more examples on the statute books where it's in there, it's written down as law, but it's not really practiced. We don't follow it. There's no punishment behind it. There's some more kind of concerning ones that have been raised as things that are not enforced very much. So we've got the underage sex type things aren't punished or enforced quite a lot. Does that mean they're not a law anymore? This thing keeps flying around. The point remains, you can pick apart these legal theories and think about what actually constitutes proper law. So where were we? Here we are. You can take this concept further still. Okay, is this going to move? Here we go. Again, this is another image that I find quite evocative of this concept. There's 2 sides to every story, and especially so here, there's probably even more sides. When you look at this picture, there's quite a lot going on, and you can look at it from the perspective, from the shoes of all the different people in it. So the people on the police side, when you initially see this picture, you might see them as the protagonists. They're helping put down some kind of revolt or possibly a riot of some kind. And from their perspective, they're upholding the law. They're doing the right thing. They're helping out the government. They're making people safe. All good. But from the other side, those people may well have criminal intent. They may well be out rioting. But it's also possible that they're protesters, that they're out exercising their rights to dissent, and the police are possibly preventing them from doing that. One theory, one idea that comes up quite a lot is this conflict between the police and enforcement and people's right to disobey, essentially, to dissent, to disagree with the government. And that again comes back to Austin's idea, because remember, the sovereign had to be habitually obeyed. If people are out exercising their right to protest all the time, disagreeing with the government all the time, the government could no longer plausibly claim to be habitually obeyed. They're being disagreed with constantly. People are disregarding their rules. They could then potentially lose their authority to the extent all of their law becomes invalid in a procedural positivist sense. Remember, we're talking about how the law is made here and why we follow it rather than the moral content. So that's a big question that comes up a lot, is to what extent dissent has to be put down, has to be controlled, and whether that's a good thing or not. So it's something to keep in mind there, this relationship between the state and control and threats into obedience. Of course, Austin's theory is just one of many, and people have come later that don't quite agree with him. And we're going to look at one of those now. So I'm going to give you another kind of situation. Here we've got another scenario. We've got a bit of a stick-up. Someone's got a gun and he's saying, "Give me your wallet." Let's think of Austin's rules again. He's the sovereign. Sovereign being someone in charge. I'd say the guy with the gun's clearly in charge in that situation. I think you'd all agree. Secondly, you must be in the habit of obeying. If you've got a gun to your head, unless it's some really serious issue, you're probably going to do what they say. So that would work. It's a command. Give me your wallet. And it's backed up by a sanction. Do it or I'll shoot you. Is that a law? Seen shaking heads? No, it's probably not. We wouldn't recognise that as a law. Under Austin's idea, we should. But this comes along Herbert Hart, very famous, eminent legal scholar. And he said, "Well, Austin, you've not really thought this one through entirely. You've got the basics, but there are some additional things that we require for a law to be seen as valid." And he says, in addition to there being a rule passed down with all this sanction and so on, we also must have some secondary rules. And that's where you get back to, okay, the law has to be issued by the Parliament. And additionally to that, he goes back to a bit of the social contract. He's saying the sovereign has to be agreed to. We have to recognise the validity of these secondary rules and consent to them. You can probably think of the mechanism by which we consent to that in modern times. And that's the electoral system, we vote in the parliament to pass laws on our behalf. And because of that, we've given it our kind of blessing. Then we can accept the laws that are passed by parliament when we wouldn't accept these laws or commands issued by some other force. Again, there could be a situation where that would change. There's been revolutions in the world where what was previously a protest movement has risen up to become the government and replace it. They make their own little secondary rules. But the idea is basically not anything can be a rule just because it's got those sanctions behind them. There's more to it, as Herbert Hart argues. Okay, so that leads us to another idea about why it is we might be obeying the law. And that's the idea of natural law. And this brings in a lot of things from morality. This is a somewhat complex topic, but hopefully I'm going to be able to explain it. And the clue's sort of in the name. The idea here is that law is supposed to be reflective of what's happening in nature. There are already these principles laid down that we are meant to follow. You can probably already see ways that that's going to be problematic, and we're going to explore those as we go along here just now. So historically, of course, so I mentioned that it's about natural law, it's about the idea of recognising rules in nature. Because of that, this was historically linked to religious ideas. Is this stuck again? There we go. It's probably going to fly forward. The reason for that is if you're thinking, okay, the law is coming from nature, and times gone by, that's just how people understood the world. The law was understood, the world was understood as having gods behind everything. People were very religious. It was part of the culture and so on. So this idea of natural law is very entwined with the Bible and gods and so on. That's St. Thomas Aquinas. He posited the idea that if you take anything back far enough, the answer is God. But for religious scholars, he said, who made this desk? A carpenter. Where did the carpenter get the wood? From the trees. Who made the trees? It came from an acorn. Where did the acorn come from? Another tree. Who made that tree? And it goes on and on and on and on until you get back to an original cause, the Big Bang. Who made the Big Bang? God, apparently. And that's why we've got this religious backing behind a lot of this stuff. However, the religious backing behind these things hasn't always been a good thing. Mostly the religious idea has been used to make moral laws, but you can probably think of a lot of examples where the religious aspect of it and the doctrinal aspect of making law has been used to justify not so nice things. So some older examples, you've got the Crusades. That was seen as a kind of moral thing to do because of superiority and so on. And another very interesting legalistic thing that was done was the Salem witch trials and witch burning. That's an absolutely fascinating thing that happened, because if you go back to that time, it was all codified, it was all legal, what they were doing. They had procedural trials, they had evidence, they had witnesses, all that stuff. They had legal punishments for it as well, the burning. But it was all based on things in the Bible and this idea of reality that spirits are a real thing. If that's how you understand the world, then the content of the law can change. And that gets me to the key difference between positivism, what I talked about before, this idea of the law being formed in the right way, and natural law. Positivists are worried about how the law is made. Natural lawyers aren't as worried about how the law is made. They're more worried about what's in the law, the content of the law. Is the law reflective of these natural principles? Is it moral? Is it good? And so on. So that's a key difference here and something to keep in mind as we're going through this section. It was religious in history, but nowadays you can still be a natural lawyer without necessarily being religious. A lot of natural lawyers are now secular. They don't worry about God or gods. And they see morality could come from the Bible, but it can also come from nature. There might be some things that are just universally agreed upon or universally seen. It could come from inside people, what we agree to, and you can think of some movements that would maybe tell us about morality as well. The key here being that it's not just about who's telling us what morality is, it's about what we agree to, and that you don't need to be a religious person to accept it. And we're worrying about exactly where all this comes from. Right, so now trying to explain a slightly tricky aspect of natural law. And this is something that sometimes takes a little bit of thinking to get. When you're thinking about law reform, you're normally thinking of what is, here's what the law is, but we need to make it better. So is and what ought to be are contrasted with each other in our normal way of thinking. We need to improve things. For natural lawyers, though, what is... Oh, that's flying forward again. That was going to be a powerful point, I promise. What is and what ought to be are the same, is the point there. It doesn't like that slide at all. Never mind. The point I was making there is, for now, what ought to be are the same. Okay, the principles that are meant to be reflected by the law already exist. It's the law that itself that's imperfect. Our understanding of the world that's imperfect. So in their argument, they would go back to the Salem witch trials and say, okay, that law was valid at the time, but through our human reason, that's our main tool, we are able to get through all of that material and improve it. So the law improves. The situation, the actual facts, were real the whole time, but we just didn't understand them. So another way of thinking about that is, if this goes back one more, yeah. Another way of thinking about that is essentially people and culture and our endeavour towards understanding the law as a bit of an archaeological exercise. We see the world one way now because we've used our reason to clear out all the other things around it, so we now don't believe in spirits, and it doesn't inform our understanding of the world or the law. We understand that there's some universal principles that we all agree to, and we've cleared it away like an archaeologist would uncover, say, an old ruin or something and understand what it looked like. But we're probably not there yet. We probably need to use even more to make the law better and better and make it more reflective of reality. So I hope that makes sense. It's a slightly complex, counterintuitive part of natural law thinking, but it's really quite an interesting way of thinking about the world. It's all there for us to discover. We just need to get better at discovering it. So here's some key positions about natural law and why we obey it. So the law, in this idea, the law is coming from something higher up, maybe a god, but probably more natural principles. If we can't find something in this natural order, we probably shouldn't be obeying it. It shouldn't be seen as valid law. So that's an interesting point. The law should reflect morality, another interesting point, and that adds a bit of a human element to natural law. We have to think about what do we accept as moral, and good can be observed by deducing things. So this reason that I got to before. A couple of important people when we're talking about that are John Finnis and Lon Fuller. And I used the example of archaeology before. I like to think of these guys as the guys who make the trowels. They have come up with some ideas about how we can better reason. So that's what a lot of natural law is about these days. How can we better reason so that we don't come up with laws that are unfair, that don't reflect our proper values and things like that? And you can probably think of some universal values that we'll share. And these guys have been really helpful in making it so that they can be reflected in law. So we've got things like human rights. We all accept everyone's got a right to life. We all accept that people are made equal and all that these days. Whereas in the past, we didn't, because they didn't reflect our understanding of nature. So these guys say, they gave us some additional requirements. Fuller was saying things like, we need to look at what people would accept. If we would reject a law, then it can't be moral, it can't really be reflective of our understanding of the world. So even if something is like scientifically there, we can still think more about it, is what he's saying. Finnis, he made the point, I was talking about human rights there, he said some things are just universally good. You don't necessarily need to have proof that people deserve the right to life, and things like that. Laws of social thing, if we would adhere to certain things or we would reject it. And he had this idea that people usually are going to be reasonable, therefore we should try and use this more collective approach to law. And we'll return to this idea of collectivism shortly. However, again, as with all the theories we've looked at today, you can probably think of some issues with natural law, and there are a lot of people who don't like natural law thinking very much at all. So an example would be abortion. That's a good kind of case study to look at kind of natural law thinking. There's people on both sides of the abortion debate. It should be allowed, it should not be allowed. But let's say you're saying it shouldn't be allowed. If you're using natural law ideas, that'd be quite an easy argument. It doesn't occur in nature. Abortion's a medical intervention, therefore it shouldn't be allowed. And that's where a lot of the kind of more religious parties who don't like abortion take their reasoning from and see it as moral. However, if you were to want abortion to be passed, you could still use natural law thinking if you refer back to these more modern guys, Finnis and Fuller and so on, by using reason. Say, okay, abortion maybe doesn't occur in nature, but we all use medicine, pretty much. Only a select few people wouldn't accept medicine. That's a natural thing that's evolved over time in society. Use of abortion as a medical intervention. Therefore, abortion should be accepted because it's part of medicine. And you could also refer to other rules. But, okay, we agree people have the right to decide this thing about themselves. Why is that a different thing? So you can still justify these things using the natural law perspective. But as you can see, the reasoning is much less direct. It's much more circular and somewhat tortuous. It also leads to the point that Hans Kelsen made. He actually he was about long before Fuller and Finnis, but the point he made remains the same. Natural law can basically be used to justify anything. So you can think of it throughout history as being used to justify not giving the gay rights movement a look in, and then over time being used to justify it. So you could use it any way you want. So he called it a harlot at everyone's disposal. Bit of a colourful analogy. But that pretty much sums it up. It's a very interesting legal theory, but in terms of actually working out what the law is meant to be, it ends in arguments that go round and round and round, and all we can really do is go back to what Finnis and Fuller are doing and argue about, okay, how should we work out what morality is? It doesn't really help us work out what the law should be, which is what it sells itself as kind of being. So I hope that makes sense with natural law. Couple of scenarios about laws that we would maybe obey or not using a natural law outlook. So imagine a teacher decides that all pupils with red hair will no longer have classes. Instead, they're going to clean the school. So the redheads are being discriminated against now, but it's been passed as a rule. Would you accept that rule? Okay. People are shaking their heads. People with red hair in the room especially shaking their heads. It's something. It's so outside our way of thinking about what's fair a lot that we wouldn't accept it. So we can go back to Lon Fuller. We wouldn't accept this, so it probably would be rejected. However, you can probably think, if you just change those words round slightly, you can probably think of a lot of laws that actually are a lot more like that than we would hope. Especially some recent laws. People aren't always treated equally in the law. The most modern example today would be immigration law. Very uneven, very unequal. We maybe don't agree with it, but by and large people are following it and people are accepting it. So we'll be getting some troubling situations with this way of thinking. Another scenario is going to fly forward in a second. Just remember it. Imagine you've been travelling around the world for 20 years and you come back to the UK, and at customs they say, right, put your hand on the table, you're getting your pinky cut off. That's what we're doing now. Anyone who comes into the UK has to get their pinky cut off. I think I broke the computer when I was doing that. There we go. Are you going to be like, yeah, okay, put your hand on the table? No. The very idea of doing that is just mad. It's like, it seems so out there. But again, I used this idea a little bit earlier. Imagine you're a bit of an alien and you're looking at a culture for the first time. The things they do might seem absolutely mad, but they accept it because it's what they've been doing. But when it's so outside that your way of thinking, you might reject that rule entirely. For you, it's not law, but for the society, it is. And that raises the interesting question about natural law is, how individual is it? Are you, by rejecting those rules, if you don't accept that as law, and then you don't do it, have you disobeyed the law? It's not your law, but it's the society's law. It gets us to all these really tricky questions that unfortunately we can't answer here, but are really worth thinking about. Okay, as we could go on and on forever. This thing has stopped working, so I'm going to use the mouse now. There we go. So the last thing I would like to look at today, we're getting to our last kind of topic. We're going to return to social contracts and the idea that law is a useful thing that we all agree to. And we're going to inquire into that idea and see, do we agree to it? Is it that useful? And so on. Okay. So you might remember this chap, Jeremy Bentham, already explained his idea on an individual level that the pleasure of committing crime is weighed against the pain of being punished. He used the same idea. He's what's called a utilitarian, and the idea that the law is of use. So the idea is that society agrees to follow the social contract, follow rules, because the pleasure of doing that outweighs the pain, the potential pain of the chaos that could result from the social contract. Some legal scholars who talked about social contract would agree with that. So we've got Thomas Hobbes, he mentioned the war. Other people might not agree as much. John Locke, he said, actually in a natural state we'd probably get along fine, we just wouldn't respect each other's property very much. So he says, so for that reason we have the social contract, so he agrees less. But the idea, basically, we follow the law, we agree to it because it helps us out, we can live a sort of peaceful, productive life because we've agreed to all of this. So again, to use my favourite old example there, the red traffic light, one reason, if you take a utilitarian stance, the reason we're stopping at the red traffic light is so we don't all go through it at the same time and cause a gigantic pile up and it takes us all 2 hours to get to work when you could have stopped for 2 minutes at the light, which was still annoying, but not as annoying as having to sit there in a big pile up the whole time and costly. Utilitarianism means we suffer slight inconvenience of obeying the law to reap the larger, to avoid the potential more catastrophic risks that come from disobedience. However, not everyone subscribes to this idea that the law is a useful thing to have, or that the social contract is something that makes any sense. So we've got Bentham over there, but we've got some anarchists over here. You might have heard of anarchists, and they basically reject the idea of the state. So we've got, and most of them come from more Eastern European, Russian kind of persuasion, but it has come over West in the form of socialist ideas. So Kropotkin, he said, okay, well, let's think about the social contract. We agreed to this, apparently, because we were supposed to be avoiding the strong abusing the weak. Isn't that what the state is? Isn't the state the strong telling the weak what to do? By not only have we agreed to the inconvenience of obeying the law, we've fallen right into the trap of what we were trying to avoid in the first place. Therefore, the social contract is self-defeating and pointless. So he's saying, and he also further says, if you did away with the state entirely, people would self-regulate. People would still not want to have these giant disputes, so they would have informal agreements with each other not to do certain things. Again, that raises an interesting question that I've floated around a couple of times. It might not be written law anymore, but are the people who do what Kropotkin says and self-regulate, are they still following a type of law by informally agreeing to it? An interesting point. Nozick makes the further point, he's saying, well, social contract seems unnecessary because the idea of us just not stepping on each other's toes and fighting all the time is so basic that we would do it naturally. We don't need a system to tell us to do that. He reckons the social contract's a little bit insulting. It's not giving people much benefit of the doubt. People could do it themselves. Again, of course, you can probably see why having no rules or systems whatsoever could lead to the type of abuse that they're saying wouldn't happen. But it's an idea that's worth thinking about again as to why we even need social contract. Another interesting person who talked about social contracts is John Rawls, a really interesting legal scholar, and he talked about social contracts as well. And an argument that comes up against social contract quite a lot, especially when people first learn about it, is like, I didn't sign anything. I didn't put my name on that. And he says, well, obviously, of course you didn't sign it personally. It's not an actual, literal contract that everyone's drafted together. Some countries do try and do that with their code of laws and stuff. But he says, a bit of an idealist. He's like, society should be organised in such a way that people would agree to sign it if someone did put it down in front of them. So even if you didn't agree with bits of it, you look at the whole thing and say, well, you know what? All of this in sum total is good enough that I would follow it to avoid sort of the utilitarian idea of the pain that would come with it. So Rawls is quite interesting because he combines a few ideas we've seen. He's talking about society should be, so he's talking about what makes a valid law, how to make it a proper law. It should be something people agree to. He's also talking about the content. It should be good. It should be something that people like as well. So he brings together a lot of ideas of what we've seen, and he supports the idea of the social contract all in one. So he's quite an interesting idea. And he further uses the idea of human rights, liberties, the right to vote. Everyone wants those things. So if you arrange society that say, okay, you need to do this thing, you need to not kill everybody, you need to drive your car responsibly so that you can have these liberties, people would be like, okay. Most of us would agree to that, and that's his theory. Again, you may know some people who would be like, down with the system, no matter what. But his idea has been quite formative in explaining why we mostly agree to it. The scholar I'd like to end on today, someone else who talked about consensus, is one of my favourites, Ronald Dworkin. And I've chosen to end on him today because he talked about consensus, but even more than John Rawls, he brings together a huge number of ideas to make a bit of a theory of law. So he's got some positivism in here, what makes a valid law that's enforceable, that people should follow, but also what content it should have and why it's got that content and why we agree to it. So he's saying that people are an interpretive species. We have to look at things and give them meaning. So an example would be chess. You wouldn't know what the rules of chess were intuitively, and you wouldn't know the point of playing chess even if you did know the rules unless you'd grown up in that environment and knew it that way. These values that we've got can evolve into things like custom. So most of us would accept it's polite to open the door for someone and let them through. And when things get to that point, they then take on a morality. The value of opening the door for someone is seen as a moral value. And those moral values can evolve even further, that they become so intrinsic they can be reflected in the law, and they should be reflected in the law. By that process, he argues, the law itself as a larger institution, if most of them are adhering to that, law itself becomes moral. And furthermore, we have a collective morality. So most of us agree that opening the door is a good thing. Most of us agree about the rules of chess. Therefore, the legal system itself is reflective enough that it's enforceable on everyone, even if you don't agree with the individual rules. So, regardless of whether you agree with Dworkin's reasoning there, I've shown him because he's come up with a really elegant theory that brings together lots of reasons as to why it is we obey the law together. Okay. So, just to recap, a few reasons why we might obey the law. We might generally agree to it, might worry about being punished, might believe in it in a moral sense, worried about looking bad because everyone else is agreeing to it, and it helps make society a bit more organised. But there's all sorts of reasons about that. Is the state really necessary? Do we need social contracts? Where's morality even coming from? And what about difficult cases? So imagine the law's been encountered in a hard instance where you don't know what to do. Who's right and who's wrong? And who do you follow? Okay, so that's us out of time. Just about got through it all. Thanks very much for your attention. Hope you enjoyed the talk, and hope you enjoy talks that are coming up in the rest of the day. Thanks.